Thank you, Taran. Good afternoon. Why are we talking about governance, and why is it important in the context of response to climate crisis? Well, I think it's important because, for me, climate crisis is a result, essentially, of governance and politics failure. Scientists have been clear for decades that climate change is happening, that the impacts will be devastating, and that it's much cheaper to act now than to delay action into the future. Yet, the pace of political response has been lacking. The economics has responded with providing solutions. We have seen the growth in the renewable energy, the cost of solar and wind has fallen. Yet, why are we not seeing everywhere response that requires the urgency that scientists and also economists are telling us? And the reasons for that are short-termism in the political approaches. Politics is essentially driven by electoral cycles, which makes it more difficult for politicians to take longer-term perspectives that the climate response requires. It also means that policies are vulnerable to elections, climate policies. And another challenge has been weak accountability for implementation. In some cases, we are seeing politicians making promises, setting ambitious targets, but then sometimes targets are not set. So what it means is that to target and to really tackle climate crisis, we need to find effective governance solutions which would address politics and how the society overall, including the government, the parliament, the private sector, the civil society and citizens, actually manage the response to climate crisis. And that requires having very clear objectives on what we're trying to achieve in terms of targets on emissions and adaptation measures. It also requires mechanisms that allow us to withstand political change. When elections come, when governments changes, we need to bring durability, shared objectives and shared sense of purpose into political response to climate. And we also need stronger mechanisms for accountability for implementation. And effectively what it means, having looked at the experience of many countries in addressing climate crisis, we have come up with 9 key governance functions that any country trying to tackle climate crisis should consider and find a way to address. And those are some I already mentioned, so very clear narrative around climate response, narrative that is clear to citizens, it is clear to political parties, it is clear to government ministries and departments, and clear objectives. Secondly, to get that clear shared narrative and that acceptance that can withstand political change, we need a knowledge base that is independent, credible, and is accepted across the political spectrum. And this is where independent advisory bodies on climate change, or climate councils that we're discussing today, are very central, as I will show in the example of the United Kingdom. Then we need to have mechanisms to articulate strategy and to back it up by short and medium-term targets, a way to integrate climate objectives across all different relevant laws and policies, be it transport, be it agriculture, be it water policy or food nutrition policy. And we need to have coordination mechanisms so that different ministries can coordinate amongst themselves on climate and make sure, for example, that the budget process addresses and integrates climate concerns, but also mechanisms to engage stakeholders, and interested parties such as businesses, civil society, but also representatives of citizens in the process. And to establish mechanisms to channel finance and investment to make sure that climate objectives are actually implemented. And very importantly, to establish mechanisms for accountability and oversight and enforcement. And this is again where climate councils play a key role, as I will show later, by playing a role of a watchdog, independent assessor of the progress that the country is making in reducing emissions and in adapting to climate change. So one way through which countries have been reforming their governance systems to ensure those different functions are met is through climate change laws. And in the recent years, we have seen remarkable growth in the climate change legislation around countries. And one of the reasons why climate laws are so important is because they help withstand that political change over sectoral electoral cycles. So this picture here shows the number of climate laws and policies around the world in 1997 when the Kyoto Protocol was adopted. And we are tracking at the Grantham Research Institute all of climate and climate-relevant laws and policies around the world. And at the time, we have counted about 70 of such laws and policies. This is a picture as of last year. There is no country in the world now which doesn't have some form of climate policy or climate legislation. And of course, the subset of countries which have climate laws, like Iceland, is slightly smaller, but it's still growing. Now, if we look at what are countries focusing on in their climate laws, this is a recent analysis we have done looking at those countries which have already legislated net zero targets. So globally, we have counted 28 countries which have done that, while 70 countries have committed to net zero targets, 27 have legislated, and we've analyzed 24 of those laws plus the European Union climate law to see what countries are focusing on in their legislation. And what we find is that initially a lot of focus has been on setting strategies, defining narratives, so climate laws focus quite a lot on that. However, there have been generally less emphasis yet on ensuring that there are mechanisms at the national level to generate independent knowledge, that non-political knowledge that I was talking about, and also to coordinate and mainstream climate concerns across the ministries. And looking at the current challenges in implementation, many countries have realized that this has been a major gap and weakness in the climate response so far, and this is where a lot of focus is now. For example, Spain is currently in the process of establishing an independent advisory body on climate change. Many countries are, like Iceland, reforming their independent advisory bodies and advisory councils on climate change. So here are some examples. So overall in the world at the moment, there are many countries which have established some form of independent advisory bodies on climate change, which are not part of the government. They are set to provide independent assessment of scientific information relevant to climate change, but also provide specific advice on climate targets. And here are some examples. I will talk about UK example in a minute. Jakob will talk about Denmark in detail, but climate councils have also been established in Ireland, in Finland, in Sweden, in Germany, outside of the EU, in New Zealand, and there are also many developing countries, for example, Philippines, which have independent climate councils. It's important to say that the mandate and the purpose of those institutions differ in each country. So we can see here that, for example, in Ireland, the Climate Change Council of Ireland is tasked with assessing and providing advice on how Ireland is making transition to a low-carbon, climate-resilient economy. And it also provides contribution to critiquing, informing and shaping response on climate change in general. And that council was established by the climate change law in 2015. In the UK, the remit of the climate change committee is actually stronger, so they provide advice on the level of carbon targets. They also assess the performance of the UK in meeting carbon budgets, and very importantly, the government is obliged under the law to actually respond formally to the advice by the Climate Change Committee. So if they don't take it into account, they have to take, or if they don't follow the advice, they have to explain why. So there's quite a lot of international experience that we can learn from. And I'd like to talk a bit more about the UK example first. So the UK climate change legislation was established in 2008. It was the first comprehensive national climate law internationally, which established legally binding emission reduction targets. And it also created the system of 5-yearly carbon budgets, which are intermediate steps of getting to the long-term target. And the initial long-term target was reducing emissions at least by 80% below 1990 by 2050. And that language of at least was very important, because later on, when it became clear that the target needs to be revised to be net zero, that allowed actually amending the act without, amending the target without actually amending the whole legislation. So currently, the target is a net zero rather than 80%. And the act also addressed action on adaptation, even not to lesser extent, but it has established provisions for continuous adaptation planning. So the government was required to produce climate risk assessment for the UK, and then based on that to prepare an adaptation strategy. And here is where the Climate Council comes in. So the Climate Change Committee was created as an independent advisory body to ensure that there is a way to safeguard achievement of those long-term goals that the legislation had. So the Committee of Climate Change consists of 7 members focusing on mitigation mainly, and 6 members of adaptation subcommittee, which are tackling adaptation challenges. But the committee members are working together also to provide a more holistic approach to climate response across mitigation and adaptation. So the committee recommends level of carbon budgets every 5 years. That recommendation goes to, let me just show you here. So this is basically the division of responsibilities between different bodies. So the committee advises on level of carbon targets. That advice goes to the government, which they consider, and they could either accept it, which historically they mostly have done, or they could challenge it, but then they have to explain why. And then that level of carbon budget goes to Parliament for deliberation, which then adopts it. And of course in the UK we have devolved administrations, the regions, which then set their own emission targets based on the guidance from the national legislation. And then at the planning stage, the government under the law has to come up with a plan on how it's going to meet the carbon budgets and to publish that plan. And then once that is published, the Climate Change Committee comes in with their independent evaluation, and they could point out to the gaps, which they did in the last few years in particular, as the UK government has been taking some steps kind of on rolling back some of the climate policies, and there has also been some shortcomings of the net zero strategy which the government has published. The Climate Change Committee really took a vocal role and provided credible analysis pointing to the gaps and how the measures proposed were still short in certain sectors. And then importantly, as I mentioned, they play a critical role in ensuring kind of monitoring progress and ensuring accountability by providing independent assessment annually on the performance of the UK on emission targets. So, and on adaptation, they also have a similar role. So every 5 years, the government has to come up with adaptation programs and risk assessments, which are again then assessed and scrutinized by the Climate Change Committee. So they play a role both on mitigation and adaptation policy. And a few years back, when the UK Climate Change Act was celebrating 10-year anniversary in 2018, we have set out at Grantham Research Institute to assess what has been the impact of the UK climate change law and what has been the effectiveness and the impact of the Committee on Climate Change. So we have interviewed over 30 leading policy experts on climate, including climate skeptics, members of parliament, government experts, private sector in the UK, NGOs as well, media, journalists who write on climate. And we have also analyzed records, every single record of every parliamentary debate in the UK over 10 years which touched or mentioned issue of climate in any way or cited information by the Climate Change Committee to understand how the information produced by the committee has been used in the political debate. And here are some of the highlights of that research. So first, what we have found is that the information produced by the Climate Change Committee has been cited 5 times more by members of parliament than the information produced by Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which provides international assessments. And in the interviews, people were telling us because Climate Change Committee was producing information relevant for the UK debate, for the UK context. And also, what we have discovered again through the interviews and also how the information was used is that the information cited by, was cited actually by all political parties across the political spectrum. So you can see here the overall citations, but also citations per seat in the parliament. Of course, the party which cited the Climate Change Committee more often per person was the Green Party. It's actually one MP, Caroline Lucas, who was very active in the discussions on climate change. But if you look overall, Conservative Party, Liberal Democrats, even SNP have been using information by Climate Change Committee. So what that showed us is that they have really become that trusted source of advice. Why? Because the members of the committee are appointed not based on their political affiliation or representing a particular stakeholder. They are appointed based on their personal professional expertise, and therefore they're seen as being politically neutral and credible. So just going back, what we also found was that the information cited by Climate Change Committee, produced by Climate Change Committee, was not only cited at the parliamentary hearings focusing on climate, on carbon budgets, for example, it actually penetrated discussions on energy bills. You can see here 40% of all hearings on energy bills included information, like members of parliament cited and relied on information from the Climate Change Committee. Infrastructure bill, 30%, that's really significant. Civil aviation bill, water bill, even in the discussions on Brexit, we found that the Climate Change Committee's information entered the debate. So what does it tell us? It tells us that the Climate Change Committee and the analysis that they produced, by being no partisan and credible, they've actually managed to help achieve that policy integration that I was talking about, ensuring that climate concerns are taken into account when debating other areas of climate policy. And so to kind of summarize it, what we're seeing in the example of the UK is that Climate Change Committee became a very effective knowledge broker. They have helped build trust and common basis in the political discussions on climate change. And they also occasionally have been acting as what we call in academic kind of circles, policy entrepreneur, which is oftentimes when the government was discussing some contested policy issues, they would actually go outside of their kind of immediate mandate of providing advice on carbon targets, but would also point out to the gaps and offer policy solutions. In particular, for example, in the debates on airport expansion, they've been very vocal in arguing against that, or in the discussions on policy around shale gas or flood defense spending. And I should also say that in the past years, since this analysis was done based on data up to 2018, the watchdog function of the Climate Change Committee has become very, very important. And what I mentioned in terms of pointing to the government and to the rest of the society that what the government is proposing to do is falling short of where they need to be to meet net zero target. What we found as well is that if we analyze the substance of the comments, is that most politicians which used information by Climate Change Committee, regardless of the party that they belong to, most of their comments were actually positive towards the Climate Change Committee, the way they used evidence. And a large share of evidence by the committee was used in the context of holding government to account in terms of performing on climate policy. And finally, sometimes people would say, well, maybe the independent advisory body would just be legitimizing what the government already is planning to do. We actually found no evidence of that. So that has not been the case. So the committee is not just a way to legitimize decisions which the government has already took previously. And now I'd like to conclude by sharing lessons with you based on the UK case, but also looking at other countries which we're constantly doing. What makes Climate Council or independent advisory body like the Climate Change Committee in the UK successful? And the first thing which makes it successful is having a clear mandate. In the case of the UK, this mandate is outlined by legislation. Some countries take a mixed approach, with the basics being in the legislation and the rest through regulation. But what is very important is to be clear what is the Council expected to do and what is its remit. And the second important element, I would say it's almost, it's not least important, it's not less important, maybe even more, is to have a government accountability to listen to the advice, to consider. We can't expect the government to follow the advice to the letter, but we should make provisions for the government to take it into account and to respond to it. And I can give you an example. We have just looked at Germany, New Zealand and Ireland, looking at the success of their climate laws and climate councils. And Germany doesn't have that requirement for the government to respond and to consider the advice of the climate council. And comparatively, what we can see, so far the council has been having more difficulty to make impact because of the lack of that accountability that the government has to respond to its advice. Thirdly, the council needs resources. So there needs to be some way to ensure that there is adequate and predictable funding. The size of the council needs to be small enough to be effective, but it needs to have resources. In European countries, councils range between 5 and 15 persons on average, depending on the country. Some are supported by secretariat, like in the case of the UK. Fourth, high level of technical expertise, and that expertise needs to touch on all of the key important areas for climate policy. So climate science, climate economics, behavioral sciences, social sciences, and expertise in the key sectors which are important for your country for the transition. Independence from the government, that is a tricky one. Different countries approach it differently, but important is for the council to have a way to take decisions on autonomously, so that they're not seen as an extension of the government, but really are independent politically and administratively. They could sit in the government's building, but they should have authority to take their own decisions. And finally, parliamentary oversight. In the case of the UK, but also in many other countries, this is crucial, because when the report on progress is made in the UK every year, it goes to Parliament. The minister responsible for performance and climate law has to face the Parliament and respond to questions when the performance is not adequate. And that creates a way for political accountability. Well, the next step, of course, is judicial review if Parliament is not able to kind of lead to action. But that is a very important step. So I'll stop there, and here just some concluding thoughts that climate councils really can help create this required political buy-in and public support by producing non-partisan and trusted and credible basis, informational basis for climate policy. They also can help enhance legitimacy and accountability of policy-making process. And what we have also seen that failure to establish such processes, effective independent expert advisory bodies, can expose implementation of climate policy to additional political pressures, which could derail net zero transition and adaptation. Thank you so much.